So I'll start by giving a little introduction about myself, which I kind of got into there. But I'm a certified industrial hygienist. I trained at University of Michigan in both chemical engineering and industrial hygiene, and was lucky enough when I moved to Boston to become part of the EH&S program, Environment, Health, and Safety program at MIT. Spent most of my career there at MIT. And was lucky enough that MIT always required that industrial hygienists work on all new laboratory designs. So that was really my focus of my work for many years, was really becoming a laboratory ventilation expert, a field that I love dearly. Very specialized field. There's only a few of us like Ken around that really can delve into that completely. And then in the last couple of years, I moved over to Draper, which is a nonprofit R&D engineering firm, really expert in guidance systems. At one time was part of MIT. And so there, where I'm the director of the EH&S office, you'll see it there. And there's my email address if any of you want to contact me. If you're too shy to ask questions during the presentation, feel free to email me. It's a small office, again, really oriented around R&D and the laboratory environment. So that's really my shtick. The other thing I do is do training for Eagleson Institute up in Sanford, Maine on laboratory HVAC basics. So what I thought would be useful to the audience today, hopefully, was to provide some regulatory review from the US perspective. I wish I was an expert in the European chemical safety management, but not so much, but I learned a lot today from Heidi. And we'll look at the chemical inventory specifically. What's that look like in a centralized procurement environment, and what's that look like in a decentralized procurement environment, with centralized being where I am now at Draper, decentralized being what I experienced at MIT, and then some risk assessment and other uses for that inventory. It's always great to learn something new when you do a presentation. So when I was looking for an image for this slide covering regulations, I found it's the 50th anniversary of OSHA. So that's great, 1970 to 2020. So that's our regulatory agency for protecting the American workforce. And it is very understaffed, and probably as a result of our capitalistic approach to things. So the standards that I thought I would cover, the hazard communication standard, the what we call the laboratory standard, occupational exposure to hazardous chemicals in labs. The HAZCOM standard was about 1970. The lab standard was about 1990. There are some EPA requirements. So those two I'm going to cover very thoroughly. The third one there, EPA requirements. The EPA regulations, there is the Tier 2 regulation requires reporting when amounts exceed the threshold planning quantities. And that's that really came about after the Bhopal incident in India, where it was realized that a lot of times local communities don't know about these extremely hazardous, extremely acutely toxic chemicals that might be in their community. So that's what that's all about. So we report to the local emergency planning community in addition to EPA for that standard. More recently, the process hazard assessment standard came out from OSHA, which I have not worked much with because that's really oriented towards the petrochemical industry and making sure that where large quantities of hazardous chemicals are manufactured or used, that a process hazard assessment is done to make sure the controls are adequate. And then finally, we have building codes that limit the amount of hazardous materials by floor that you can have, and that's very important in the R&D environment. And an inventory that's probably one of the most important uses for a chemical inventory, to make sure you can meet the amount of, you're only allowed to have a certain amount of flammables per floor, a certain amount of toxic gases per floor, and make sure you're in compliance with those building codes. So the hazard communication standard, again, this was a groundbreaking standard in the US for making sure that employees have access to information about the hazards of the chemicals that they're working with. And it was recently updated. Again, we heard about global harmonization today, and that was great to try to we are a global community, and to try to address the concerns and the problem of communicating to workers in an effective way about the hazards of their chemicals. I mean, that is a very tall order, and I've been very happy with the pictogram approach. I think it works for both the R&D environment, and I'm hoping it works just as well in the manufacturing environment. There is some of the requirements of that standard. The written plan training. Training is really important. We talked about that some today already, making sure that employees know when they're in the hazard communication, the non-lab environment. So for example, where I am at Draper right now, that might be, the custodians, for example, would be under HAZCOM, not under the lab standard. They're not working in a laboratory. Our facilities group, making sure that they get training about assessing the hazards of the materials that they work with. So that training, it's typically done on an annual basis by people like myself. The regulatory standard is that they've done whenever process changes are made. That can be a really tough thing to kind of keep track of. So most people have gone to an annual kind of training. And hopefully, more importantly, that we've developed a good relationship with our employees so that whenever they get a concern or a question, they're coming to us and asking us. I mean, that's really our goal. And to try to establish those good relationships so that we know we're giving them good, accurate advice, and so they'll come back as frequently as needed. The standard also regulates chemical labeling, and that's really important for manufacturers. And we talked a little bit about safety data sheets. You know, that was a big change. Not much changes in the EH&S world, but when we went from MSDS to SDS, I mean, that was really earth-shattering for people. We had to rewrite a lot of our programs and plans, and I'm sure we didn't get them all changed. I also agree with others who spoke about, and I think it was Ken, maybe it was Heidi, who was talking about the 16 sections of the SDS. And definitely a big improvement was made in ensuring that there be consistency in those documents. And again, you know, as a clinician, EH&S person in the laboratory environment or non-lab environment, really helping people work through, that's a lot of information for folks to digest, and really that's a big part of our role is interpreter of that material, that information for them. And then the other requirement, and this is the closest thing that we get really to a regulatory requirement for an inventory, a chemical inventory, is that it's required that you have a list of chemicals. It's not called an inventory, so it is adequate if it's just a list of chemical and product names, and obviously requiring that SDSs be available to employees no matter what their shift, so that they can look at that if they have questions about the material they're working with, that they can take it with them if hopefully not, but if they have symptoms and they're going to an occupational clinic for evaluation, that they can take that safety data sheet with them. So most folks do electronic versions of SDSs, but as you can see here on the right, you guys have been staring at that image probably. And I put that there because I have, if you're doing the laboratory environment, when I came to Draper, they were still using notebooks, and this is typically what it could look like outside of our chemistry areas, laboratories, for example, where and it's not a very effective way, obviously, for them to find an SDS if you've got that many notebooks of SDSs. So it's interesting, the laboratory EH&S world was after OSHA to make a standard really to address the situation of laboratories. Since we have the difference between laboratories and manufacturing is usually in the number of materials that we would work with in the R&D environment. And so OSHA responded to that, and about 1990 did promulgate this performance standard. It was very interesting. I was at MIT at the time, and the standards have been talked about for many years, and then all of a sudden it came out really quickly. And a performance standard, as opposed to a prescriptive standard, basically says, figure out how you're going to have a good chemical safety program for your R&D labs and write that down in a plan. Sounds easy enough, but there's been a lot of teeth gnashing about what really is a chemical hygiene plan, who's qualified to be a chemical hygiene officer. So it was interesting, even though people demanded this performance standard once they got it. There was a lot of questions about that. Let me talk about the picture because I know people always look at pictures right away. That's a picture of and the architecture lab that I worked at MIT. And probably Ken is really aghast at the size of the ductwork on that hood.
Yes.
That's really a spray paint booth. They really were developing new building materials, and they really needed a very large hood. And so that's the supplier duct there to the right. So when you turned that hood off, also the supplier would shut off. That was about the best we could do, but it was noisy. It was effective for controlling exposures, but you know, I probably could have maybe used a green fume hood for that. I don't know.
Right.
But I liked it because I saw the SDS notebook over there on the side, and that'd be unusual for an MIT laboratory space. But again, once you get into more like architectural and shop kinds of applications, then much fewer materials. So, you know, they were keeping an SDS notebook. My hat's off to them. That's enough about the picture. So we talked about the officer, the plan, standard operating procedures. This is something that's required in the OSHA lab standard. And again, the MIT chemistry department was very clever. They were concerned, oh my, we have to write a standard operating procedure for every chemical we use. That seems really daunting. And so they came up with the approach of writing an SOP for hazardous chemicals and an SOP for particularly hazardous substances. And that's a regulatory term by OSHA. Particularly hazardous substances are select carcinogens, acute toxins, and reproductive toxins. So it was an approach that was easy to write. I'm not sure I found it that effective for the chemists, but it's an approach that's been adopted by many places because the MIT chemistry department won an award for their chemical hygiene plan. We got a lot of good press out of that, and I do know that is an approach used by some. But usually for something to be useful for researchers, it needs to be specific. So we'd like them to write very specific procedures for their own chemical use, and that's been an upward climb and difficult to achieve is my experience with that. And then the other thing that the lab standard talks about is reference material for researchers in addition to safety data sheets, because a lot of times the safety data sheets, although they've gotten better, they may or may not really, particularly for synthetic chemists, for chemists who are synthesizing materials, they'd like to know a lot of different experience, if there is any experience out there with that chemical. And so there's, in the last, I don't know, maybe 5 years or so, PubChem has come about, and there's a health and safety section now of PubChem, and that's really the best reference. If you're trying to find, you should really look up PubChem materials if you really want to know an in-depth. It's an amalgamation. Ralph Stewart, who's an EH&S person at Keene now, was at Cornell at the time, and he worked with the librarians there to sort out all the different resources and references and journals of where you might find health and safety information on a particular chemical, and put it all together in one place. It's really an amazing reference tool. So I'm publicizing that, so check that out. And then the other big change that's happened in the lab standard is we had some very unfortunate and relatively close in time events happen here in the US at UCLA and Texas Tech with pyrophore, serious accidents, and in one case a fatal accident, and in one case a serious injury, with researchers working with reactive materials. And there was a recognition that the lab standard had really been focused a lot on health hazards of chemicals and not the physical hazards of chemicals. And that for most people doing chemical synthesis, that's really the critical piece. And so if you look at the current standard, which I did for this presentation, I was glad to see that a lot of the appendices have been updated with information about how to work with physical hazards. So that was a big change that happened. And a lot of talk about how to do risk assessment and how to teach researchers how to do risk assessment of their particular experiment. So those are some really good references to look for there. So getting to chemical inventory, so what role does chemical inventory play in this? And you can see I've got my favorite pictograms. Not everybody has a favorite pictogram, but I do. Mine is Starman, the one on the left. Again, being an industrial hygienist and trained a lot in helping people deal with the chronic health effects. Obviously, when somebody's working with a carcinogen or a neurotoxin, we want to make sure they understand that. And so I've been training my researchers. Most chemicals will have the exclamation mark because that's an irritant, and just about everything, if you get it in your eye, it's going to hurt, and so it's going to have an irritant kind of a symbol. But if you see Starman and you didn't think that was a very hazardous material, then you really need to delve into that. So that's my favorite. Ken, do you have a favorite? He's stopping over here. Anyway.
Not yet.
Not yet. So what about, so for inventory, you know, the big decisions are what are you going to inventory? Is it just going to be chemicals? Is it going to be all your hazardous materials? So at Draper, we've got both biological and radioactive materials. What are we really going to inventory? Usually it is very focused on chemicals. At MIT, we had some very interesting discussions when we started our inventory program. Is aluminum foil a chemical? You would not believe the things that we got asked about whether that should be inventoried or not. So you wanted to think about that a little bit, you know, and Draper uses a simple approach, which I think is a good one, is that it has a safety data sheet, we inventory it. It should get coded as a chemical and we inventory it there as a result. So obviously chemical name, CAS number, mixtures present a lot of challenges, and at a place like Draper where we have a lot of epoxy work and soldering work, mixtures are our main, the main products that we're purchasing. And so making sure we have product names and catalog numbers, and that's not always easy because now you have suppliers and you have distributors, and they sometimes have different numbers, and so it's going to be challenging to kind of keep that straight. And then when you're databasing the ingredients into the inventory, you need to make decisions about that. You know, what percentage of ingredients, you're going to base that on the hazard of the ingredient or the amount of the ingredient. How are you really going to database that? Because you might want to do a search saying, you don't want to know all the products that we have that have formaldehyde in them, for example. So if you don't database that right away, then you're not going to be able to do those kind of searches. A lot of times we're doing searches on manufacturer and supplier. That's obviously really important. What's the amount? Amounts can get really crazy. There's all kinds of different units. And you'd be surprised, you might think that MIT engineers and scientists are really good at doing conversions in amounts, but they're not always. We usually let people, every inventory that I've worked with, we're letting the researchers put it in whatever units are the easiest for them, because otherwise we won't get the information. So it's really, they're looking at the container or the SDS and putting the amount in as a result of that. So you're gonna have all different kinds of units that you need to support. Expiration date, this is really important. Obviously, if you've got things that are peroxide formers, you want to make sure you know when that's coming up, and hopefully the inventory can notify people about that, that problem. At a place like Draper, where we're dealing a lot with military specifications, there's a huge program around this. They're very tight on making sure that all the expired materials are out of the area. So that's a really critical one for us. What about hazards? Are you going to database the hazards of the chemicals that you're working with? That's gotten a lot easier now with the pictograms, but that's a lot of discussion about how far you want to go with that. That's a lot of extra time if you're going to do that kind of databasing. And then the SARA Tier 2 chemicals, again, this would be for the EPA reporting to the local emergency planning boards. We would want to flag if any of the products we have would contain one of these SARA chemicals, so that we can have an addition. We can add up over the amounts of those materials and know whether we've are beyond the threshold planning quantity and need to report that. So there's lots of different ways you can use your inventory, and using it for regulatory compliance purposes is beautiful if you can get there. So in Draper, where it's a centralized procurement using PeopleSoft, we get an email whenever anybody is going to buy a chemical, and we ask them to provide us a chemical justification form and the safety data sheet of that material. This can be like pulling teeth. but we do work with people. But most people are ordering regularly, and so they're used to this, and they don't have any problem with it. The picture over there on the right is just the for the safety data sheets when we converted to a digital storage of SDSs rather than the notebooks. We provided information. We wanted to make sure that rather than a notebook, that the instructions of how to find your safety data sheets in the database we call CoLab, how to find that, how to search it, and to let us know if you've got any problems. Because again, that regulatory requirement that they be able to get to their safety data sheets is key, and we want to make sure we're maintaining that. So we build our inventory from the chemical orders, and we keep it at a room level. For location, we're really just keeping track of room level. Again, for synthetic chemists, like I was working with over at MIT, where they would need to go further than that, they need to go down to because they have so many storage cabinets, they need to go down to that level typically. We discussed about whether we needed to do the lab bench level. I think it got a little crazy with that. So something else that you need to decide up front. And then amounts. Big discussion in the R&D environment. Are you asking for the most I would ever have? Are you asking for the amount I have right now on hand? The average amount? Lots of discussions about that. You can have endless discussions about that if you'd like. But those are all things that you need to decide if you're starting a new program or an update of your existing one. At Draper, what we do is we do an annual check. We have chemical custodians for each laboratory area, and it's their job to make sure that what's stored in their cabinets matches what we have in the master inventory. That doesn't make us that popular sometimes. Probably 80% of the folks are more than happy. They're really lab managers, and this is their chance. They can get some help from other people in the lab, and it's just done very easily. I have others who are like, I never had to do this where I worked before. Why do I have to do this now? A lot of the university environments, some of the university environments are using graduate students or students to do this work. But you got to think about that. That's a laborious task with some risk involved. So again, you're going to use students, they need to be adequately trained and protected to do that work. And then again, at Draper for us, it's strict adherence to expiration is key. Just going to check on time, see how I'm doing.
You're good.
I'm good, okay. The decentralized procurement approach, like you might find in an R&D environment. Let's talk about the picture first. You're looking at that lab and you're going, what the heck is that? And that was how the old chemistry labs at MIT looked before we renovated. We renovated them about 20 years ago, luckily. And so I could do an EH&S inspection of that lab and spend quite a while, but I won't. But they were no daylight. They were really not great places to work, I'm guessing. We had great fume hoods. We had done a lot of research on making sure that those hoods had good containment. A lot of very early work was done with tracer gas containment testing of those hoods, and they're at the long end of a bay, which can be a perfect way to have good containment. But it was dark. And the reason I put it in here is because, as we've talked about already today, in the R&D environment, where wasn't uncommon for a chemistry PI to have 10,000 substances. And so that, and it's a big part of their work, it's a big part of their financial investment. And so when we would work with inventory in the chemistry department, they really needed an inventory just to be able to make sure they weren't buying things they already had, and for safety, but also for financial, and really a good way to run that lab. It was really necessary. When we would go talk to the biologists about doing their inventory, they were like, we really don't need this. What are we going to use it for? It was a much more difficult process there. Easier for them to do, but a more difficult sell. So you want to think about your audience, and they're very different populations. And at a place like MIT, we've got everything in between as well. Also, with complicated chemicals, you might need to have a drawing. We had to have a software where they could draw the material, not name it, because that was more effective for them. Should synthesized materials be inventoried? A lot of discussion about that. And intermediates. So some of the questions you might want to ask. It was interesting conversation with the chemists as well. They look at high volume solvents like acetonitrile, hexane, those kinds of things. That's like water to them. They didn't really even think we should inventory that. we were, obviously with things like building codes and things, we needed, and that's where the discussions about amounts comes in, because they were using so much of it and it was in and out all the time. And without doing barcoding, you know, you've got to kind of decide so again, I think typical amount is the right thing to do there. Or maybe you need maximum amount. That depends really. That's a regulatory decision. And then what I've also experienced with, this is at Draper in the biology labs we have there, since we are inventorying everything that has a safety data sheet, they use a lot of kits and they use a lot of non-hazardous materials. Those are difficult to inventory. I wish I had a good way of exempting them, and we've been talking about that to see if we can exempt them because I haven't seen a lot of added value to that activity, and it's very time consuming. So how to use your inventory, and on the right here, Heidi was also talking about plan, do, plan, do, and check. And act. And so usually an inventory is part of a management system. So, you know, you've got an inspection as part of your EH&S management system, you've got a training system as part of your EH&S management system, risk assessment, and inventory can help with all of those. And in particular, what I have been doing at Draper, since we have such a great inventory system, I look at that obviously before I go out and do an inspection of the space. So I can tell at a glance right away, what am I dealing with here? Am I dealing with something more chemistry oriented, more shop oriented, so that I can really get an idea of the risk and how I'm really going to want to focus that inspection to be the most useful. A lot of times inspections, EH&S inspections, are really kind of around the building systems. And I'm doing that for sure. I'm looking at the eye wash, I'm looking at the fume hood, I'm looking at the fire protection. But if I can ask them a question, oh, how are you handling your tin lead solder, for example? If I can really ask them a specific question like that and really start to get into some of the use, I think they find it much more valuable. And again, it's part of how I can do that relationship development with them. I may have to go back. I may not have time to really do that adequate review, but it's a great way to get started. And we might be doing that risk assessment really at a high, medium, low. That's really what I'm trying to look at when I'm looking at the inventory. And what we also know, industrial hygienists are really bad about saying sometimes, this chemical inventory, it's really not that helpful for me. I really can't look at that and tell you what the high-risk activities are in that laboratory. I really need to go and walk through it and talk to people about their uses, and that is the reality of that. So it can be a good first glance kind of risk assessment, but to really understand what the risks are in that lab, you're really going to need to go talk to people about the use. And finally, the technology solution, I mentioned this already, part of the whole EH&S. So those are some ways to use the inventory for risk assessment. And some other uses for chemical inventory. Let's talk about the picture. This is just something I found like Ken. I went out and Googled it because I had thought about the MIT Chemical Museum and I didn't have a picture of it, but this is pretty much what it looked like a long time ago. And you want to use your chemical inventory to make sure you don't end up with something that looks like this, where you don't know what you have. Obviously, probably things aren't stored by hazard type. We've got expired materials. It looks to me like there's a lot of dust there. Yeah. So something that you want in an inventory, because if you need to go inventory that's going to take a long time, and you're pretty much at that point going to say, no, we're not going to do it like this anymore. So I talked about using your inventory for inspections, training. If I'm lucky enough to, there may be specialized training that's needed. We've got training required for the HAZCOM standard and the lab standard, but we may have certain chemicals that we want to go in and do training on. For example, hydrofluoric acid, if people are working with that material, there's a very special medical antidote used for that, calcium gluconate, if you get any of that on your skin. So, you might need to do specific training, and that's a lot of what we're doing at MIT is trying to figure out which specific chemicals. A lot of times there's not a regulatory driver for that. In that case, it was the MIT medical department asking for that, so that was really great that we were able to provide that training. But that's the kind of training that users find most valuable when we can get very specific with them. We talked about environmental reporting, using the inventory to add up the amounts you have of materials, so when you need to do environmental reporting on that. Emergency response, very useful. If you've got a big campus or manufacturing environment, the inventory may help you if you get a call about that incident in the middle of the night. They usually happen on Friday afternoon, but if you get one in the middle of the night, you can have some idea what you're dealing with before you get there. So that's a very useful area. If you think that you can hand the fire department a list of 10,000 chemicals for a particular area and that's going to be useful to them, it is not. So maybe you have a system where you've got different signs on the door to the lab that may be much more useful to the emergency responders in assessing the value of what's going on in that laboratory. Another use for inventory that I've used is a new exposure limit comes out for a chemical. I can use the inventory to find out where all those users of that material are and give them an update. Say, we just reduced the TLV for acetone from 750 parts per million to 500 parts per million, or whatever it is, for instance. Then that's a great way to build a relationship. I mean, that's what users expect us to be able to initiate information like that to them. And so that's a really great use for an inventory. And then the building code compliance on amounts per floor, that's a really key use, as I mentioned earlier, for inventories. And then finally, to think about chemical inventories and what might be driving in your particular case. The federal and state requirements for a chemical inventory, at least in the US, are not that stringent, but local regulations is what I've usually seen come into play for chemical inventory. So you want to make sure that, take a look at that and make sure you're meeting those requirements. It is a good first step in the risk assessment process. I want to caution people to balance accuracy of the data with time spent. We're always in a limited resource capacity when it comes to EH&S work, and if you try to do a perfect inventory, you may not have time to do any of your other important programs, and I've seen people go down that road, so I caution you on that. And then we do want to have researchers, if they're helping us build that inventory, we don't want to take up all of their EH&S time so that they're not available to do risk assessment with us. So just some balancing that you want to do there so that you have enough information, but you can't make it perfect, or it might be all that you do. I think that's it for me. Yeah.